The first thing you notice, if you've ever worn headphones in a wartime intercept hut, is the noise that never stops. A hiss like rain that doesn't fall, a restless sheet of sound stretched across the Pacific. Under it, a tangle of voices rise and vanish. Clipped English from a supply ship calling its escort. A weather net reporting barometric pressure in sing-song numbers. A pilot cursing the way a tropical squall swallows his antenna. And then, every few minutes, a strand of speech that makes the operators sit up straighter and reach for their pencils. The syllables snap and curl in ways no one in the room has catalogued. Consonants brush together, vowels tilt and change mid-flight. It is not Mandarin. It is not Tagalog. It is not any dialect they were told to expect. Yet it pours from marine radios with the steady rhythm of trained men passing instructions under fire. They record everything. The log sheets are stamped with time, frequency, call sign where they think they've got it right, bearing if the loop antenna is behaving. A wire recorder might capture a thin ribbon of the traffic for later study, but mostly it's graphite and paper, and the hope that repetition will show pattern. The officers who trained these intercept men taught them that any signal can be broken if you collect enough of it. Languages yield, codes yield. Humans get lazy and use the same phrase twice when they're afraid and night is pressing close. So they listen for months. Guadalcanal to Bougainville to Tarawa, the same units come and go. The same artillery nets flare at dawn when forward observers check in and again in the late afternoon when someone asks for counter-battery fire. Each time, those unfamiliar syllables cut across the net, fast as a runner clearing shallow surf. The Japanese note the time, circle the bearing, mark the day's total in the margin, and vow that the next week will be the one where a seam opens. On the other end of that ocean, a Navajo Marine slipped the headset off one ear to hear the world he's standing in. Jungle sound, maybe, or the older, emptier sound of coral sand ringing under boots. He keeps one hand on the throat mic and the other over the little notebook he is not supposed to lose. An officer leans close and says that the shore party needs the beach exit marked, that the tanks are stacking up behind the dunes, that the first wave is pinned on the wrong side of a wrecked pier. The Navajo repeats the officer's meaning in his own language, but not as a simple translation. The words he speaks carry a code layered inside, a careful mapping forged in training halls and refined in field tents, where men sat cross-legged and argued the best way to say a shape that did not exist in their grandparents' world. He speaks, and the air carries it away. A second Marine down the line listens, hears the same shape of sound, and pieces it back into English before his pencil stops moving. The battery commander says Roger, corrects his guns a finger's width, and the next volley rips a path through the wall of tangled iron that was a pier not an hour ago. The beach opens like a mouth finally able to breathe. In the intercept hut, the same message arrives as pure surface. A human voice, clearly trained, clearly disciplined, passing short bursts of meaning from one point on the shore to another. The pace is staccato but never frantic. The operators can almost feel the battlefield tempo in it, the way a man who has practiced 1,000 times can talk while staring at a map his partner is drawing in the dirt. They can also feel the gaps where their ears fail. The log sheet shows a little more irritation in the margin today, a scrawl that means nothing in any code book. Sounds like ceremony, sounds like prayer, could be a hoax. The senior petty officer reads that note and shakes his head. He hears the confidence in those voices. He hears speed, too, which is the one thing he'd hoped would be missing. Most ciphers slow, men down. Even bad ciphers make them repeat themselves, falter, use filler words, chew clock. But whatever this is does not drag. It runs. The obvious orders come from above. Record more. Flag every net where the unknown language appears. Cross-reference call signs and guest positions. If one of the speakers gets sloppy, if someone starts a message in English and finishes it in that other tongue, mark it in red. The schoolhouse math, the intercept men learned, insists that if a thing happens enough times, its internal grammar will show itself, even to outsiders. They write out the syllables the way those syllables sound to ears trained on Tokyo radio, turn them into Roman letters that take a poor grasp of 1,000 timbres and press them flat. They underline certain syllable pairs because they crop up when artillery wakes, and underline others because they show up as landing craft approach. They imagine they're close. Sometimes, under the midnight bulbs when the ocean turns to a soft, endless hiss, they even believe it. Elsewhere, on transport decks and in tent cities thrown up behind cane fields, the men who speak that language for their country yet cannot explain their work to strangers keep practicing. They run drills where one of them plays the role of a regimental runner who never tires, and the other plays the role of a telegraph key that can shape any word into a signal that will not choke. They remember the instruction that mattered most. Speed wins. Not only speed, of course clarity wins, discipline wins, redundancy wins, but speed in particular was the one trait the enemy could not steal by capturing a cipher wheel or finding an old pad. They could copy the glossary, yes. They might even piece together the alphabet, those clever mappings that turn a crowded English letter into a quiet Navajo word that every boy on a sheep trail knew long before boot camp. But unless they could field a human who could hear the phrase at a sprint and know how to rebuild it on the other end, they would always be late. The months wear on. The Japanese listening posts log more traffic than their analysts can meaningfully absorb. The local commanders ask whether this is a single unit, some elite communications platoon up from the mainland, or whether it has spread across the Marine Corps like vines finding a wall. No one knows. There are reports of English again, reports of plain voice nets where you can hear a corporal count the seconds between salvos. There are also reports of strange compound words that seem to substitute for everything that matters. Gun, ship, plane, ridge. The analysts file those reports and write quiet memos about metaphor, about the way some cultures use images instead of labels. They request a linguists, then a team of linguists, then a miracle. The miracle does not arrive. By the time the island names change and the beaches grow narrower, and the maps in the intercept rooms fill with pins whose strings cross so often that they pull the corkboard into a warped frown, it sinks in that the traffic they have collected is not going to yield at the pace of war. The shame does not come from inability. Exactly. It comes from the knowledge that they are listening to men tell each other how to do their jobs, and that those men are doing their jobs with consequences measured in bursts of flame on ridgelines and the white cough of a shell finding a bunker mouth. To collect is to be close. To decode is to be present. They remain close, but never present. The static goes on. The voices do, too. And the log sheets thicken like stacked doors, each of them closing on an answer just out of reach. Amphibious war is a clock that hates delay. Everything about a landing compresses time until seconds take on the weight of hours. Boats have to hit sand while the tide is right. Bulldozers must carve exits before the next wave turns the beach into a scrapyard of stalled steel. Naval gunfire must pause and resume on signals whose accuracy settles the oldest question men know: who lives and who doesn't. In that narrow corridor of time between the first crashed bow ramp and the moment a beachhead breathes for the first time, speed is not just a virtue. It is oxygen. That is why commanders began to look past the tradition of clipped, encrypted, written messages and toward a thing that felt almost primitive and yet proved more modern than any machine they owned. A human voice carrying meaning that only another trained human could pull apart quickly enough to act. The older method had its strengths. Ciphers that turned words into strings of letters and numbers could be strong enough to keep a month's worth of plans safe from any desk on the other side of the ocean. But they took time. Even a hardened, practiced clerk bent over a cipher table or twirling a strip system would burn minutes one after another, and minutes in surf cost blood. Worse, message chains multiplied delay. A forward observer might scratch his request in a book, pass it to a radioman, who would send it to a ship, where a clerk would decrypt it, carry it to an officer who would rewrite it for the gunnery team, who would finally move iron. By the time correction came back, the map had changed. A ridge had been taken, or lost. The target that seemed simple, a pillbox with a mouth like a dark coin, had already vanished as flame threw out of it and men flooded past. Commanders wanted a way to hear the battlefield as it happened, and to push reply back into it without any desk, any delay, any room for clever steel wheels to jam. Voice offered all those advantages, but came with a mortal risk. Comprehension by the enemy. The Pacific was thick with receivers. Put words in the air, and someone else would hear them. The trick was to arrange the system so that hearing did not equal understanding inside the tiny window where understanding mattered. That window was measured in minutes on a good day and in moments when things fell apart. The men who argued for the new solution understood that there is a kind of security no machine can grant. The security purchased when meaning rides on fluency, shared training, and an agreed pattern that transforms a sentence into something only a tiny community can decode in the head while hand and eye are doing three other things. The first live trials inside the Corps made believers. An officer read a message in English. The trained speakers turned it into their language with the mapped substitutions and proper order so quickly that you could hear the consonants tumble. A second speaker heard it and returned the original sense to English before the officer's watch ticked through a full half-minute. It wasn't a demonstration of mystical unbreakability. It was a demonstration of tempo, of how war actually behaves when you are close enough to smell cordite and the wind tastes like salt. The experiment could not be explained well in a conference room, but anyone who had leaned over a ship's rail and watched landing craft waddle through surf understood. It was the difference between telling your runner to go find the captain and tell him that the east exit is blocked, and looking up to see the captain standing right there, already pushing men toward the west gap because he heard you as you drew a breath. The radios themselves rewarded this choice. Portable sets that once had to be coaxed into behaving by a man with hands like a locksmith's had matured. The clunker that filled a pack with the weight of a man had gotten a little lighter, a little more forgiving, a little more eager to put a voice out into the thick air of a hot morning. With proper net discipline, a battalion could thread a dozen conversations through a few frequencies without drowning. The talkers learned how to be precise without being clotted. They listened for the moment in a sentence where a single noun did all the work of a clause. They learned what makes an artillery correction land, as if the gunner's eye were sitting on the same hump of coral as the forward observer. That learning showed up as time saved, and time saved showed up as lives that kept speaking. Commanders kept one eye on security, even as they embraced the speed. It would have been simple to wrap a human language in a few extra ritual phrases, call it a day, and hope the other side never figured out what the mouth was saying. But the people building the system understood that war rots shortcuts, so they layered the vocabulary with planned obliqueness. They created a way to spell the alphabet that did not sound like any book learning. They built a set of terms that mapped new machines and old ideas to words whose shape had been sung by elders long before the Corps ever issued a field manual. They rotated, revised, expanded. The men with headsets learned to shift accordingly, to incorporate additions without stopping the flow. Above all, everyone agreed to the rule that mattered. If this ever slows us down, we do not deserve it. Those months when the program spread through regiments left an imprint that the after-action reports never quite captured. You can see it in letters home, in the way a line sergeant writes that he doesn't understand the details, but likes the way the gunfire starts to walk the ridge the instant he speaks. You can see it in fleet reports where a destroyer's gunnery officer remarks that corrections from shore sound like a friend on the next bar stool, close, fast, and sure. And you can see it in the enemy's strained records, which might call the strange speech chanting one day and signal slang the next, the terms changing as the frustration deepens and the pressure rises. The case for voice at the heart of violent, confusing operations did not rest only on speed. It rested on resilience. If a codebook is blown, you change it, and the change ripples out as a terrible slowing. If a machine breaks, you fix it, or you are mute until you can. If a trained speaker falls, another takes his place and the net breathes on. The commanders saw that human systems, properly trained and protected, fail with a different curve. They sag, then rally, then absorb. On beaches where nothing stayed in place for more than a handful of minutes, that kind of failure curve was the only one a unit could afford. The final proof for the men who had to sign their names came not from a pristine demonstration but from the ugliest thing war does. The moment when the landing is drifting toward disaster and the only path through is for everyone in the chain to act like a hand that knows its own fingers. A call would go out, the syllables would fall into the air, and guns offshore would twist their muzzles a hair's breadth in the right direction. The ground would shudder. The way forward would open a slit. No document could summarize how that felt when the world was screaming. The commanders only knew that they had asked for a way to talk at the speed of peril, and that, somehow, through an alliance of voices and design and trust, they had found it. To understand why the strange voice traffic baffled trained ears, you have to see how the system refused to behave like the ciphers that the textbooks adored. It was not an alphabet baked into rotors. It was not a pad of random numbers that a clerk might shred with trembling fingers as alarms sounded. It was a living structure that took an ancient language, mapped modern war onto it, and then taught young men to move through that map as if it were a familiar trail they could run in darkness. The result, when heard on the air, was speech that any civilian might mistake for free conversation until you noticed the way it kept solving problems at the speed of need. The base layer was a lexicon, but calling it a dictionary misses the point. It was a bridge between worlds. Things that did not exist in the old stories needed names that felt honest in the mouth and clear in the ear. Machines of steel and oil needed to be called by images that were not so obvious that an outsider could guess, yet not so obscure that two Marines from different families would argue over meaning while shells shook the dirt under them. Families of words were chosen because they bound themselves to one another in memory. Air and wing and bird might carry work for planes. Sea and turtle and fish might carry work for ships. But there was more to it than metaphor. There were patterns of substitution, adaptive slots that could be filled with more than one term, so that a habit could not be harvested by the kind of arithmetic that thrives on sameness. Then there was the alphabet. That alphabet existed not as a child's chant taught under lamplight, but as a ladder a mind could climb while the body ducked under a stump and the radio hissed. Letters were not letters anymore, but hand-picked words whose first sounds could be peeled off cleanly when needed. Spelling something letter by letter felt slow only until you realized that each letter was a whole word being crushed to its initial shape by a man who had learned to do it without breaking the rhythm of his breath. When you stacked those initial shapes together and passed them over the air, what came through to the trained ear was a short melody of words that looked like sense to a bystander, but meant something precise to the man who knew what initial to pluck from each. The system listened to its own weaknesses and corrected them. Synonyms were introduced so that the same target did not always carry the same image. If an outsider wrote down every instance of a particular bird and tried to argue that it must always stand for the same thing, he would be wrong by design. The war was teaching the talkers as they taught the war how to listen. A report from one island would prompt a revision before the next, and the men entrusted with the speech carried those changes with a seriousness that no printed manual could enforce. They corrected each other, not out of pedantry, but out of the same duty that makes a gun crew lean into a breach as if it were a partner. Inside that culture, mistakes were small fires that everyone stamped at once. An example helps, though no single example ever captures the whole. Imagine a forward observer hunched behind a low lip of volcanic ash, where the wind comes like a weight out of the open sea. He needs a battery to walk its shells left by a measure that only the men on the gun know by heart. He keys his mic and speaks in his language, chooses the words that map to the letters that matter, chooses the image that makes the correction unambiguous. On the ship, a talker hears it and returns the sentence to English so fast that the gunnery officer can keep both hands on his plot without pausing to glare at a clerk for being slow. The guns answer. The ash shakes. The observer squints and says, again in that easy run of syllables, to come left a hair more, then fire for effect. It happens in the time it takes a wave to lean and fall. To an outsider, the recording of that exchange sounds like two men trading short phrases that fall somewhere between music and instruction. To the men inside the exchange, it is as crisp as tapping a nail into timber. The radios that carried these messages were not conjuring tricks. They were tools built under pressure, improved in ways that only enlisted men can fully appreciate, because they were the ones who had to set an antenna with their teeth while someone yelled at them to keep their head down. The microphones were rugged, the batteries finicky, the edges of corrosion a constant battle. But when a set behaved, and the net stayed clean, the human system riding on it took flight. The talkers kept their messages short because brevity pleases both physics and war. They kept their phrases compact because open air mangles frills. They kept their attention on the little seam where clarity meets speed because that seam is the only place a living thing can run without tearing itself open. It is easy in retrospect to call the secrecy that cloaked this work a veil that adds drama to an already dramatic story. In the moment, it was a practical necessity. If the system's details had become common knowledge among men who did not need to know them, those details would have leaked into places where inclusion means risk, and risk means delay. The talkers themselves carried the weight of that secrecy like any other pack. They read in their commanding officer's face that praise would be quiet, that recognition would be deferred past the moment when it could win them a free beer in a ship's canteen, and they shouldered it because the work fed their platoons and their regiments, and the men who counted on a path opening in the smoke. What they built together was not a magic language and not a perfect cipher. It was a tool that fit the hand of the war they were fighting. It gave commanders a way to move fire and men without creating a trail that a desk could follow before dusk. It let young Marines trust that when they spoke into a throat mic with their heart banging like a drum inside a metal helmet, the answer would come back in time to matter. And it made the other side listen helplessly, which in a war of nerves is its own kind of pressure. There are few victories purer than speed that remains clear after the third repetition. There are fewer still that can be carried by memory alone, from one island to the next, as the ocean keeps trying to wash the board clean. On a humid morning that leaves sweat stippling the wood of tables, a set of headphones rests on a stack of logs in a low building painted to vanish into jungle shade. The man who wears those headphones can sketch a Morse net from memory. He can tell you by the tempo of a new operator's hand whether he learned his trade on shore or at sea. He can identify the scratch of a distant generator that needs its brushes replaced. None of that helps when the voice net comes alive, and the syllables he does not know pour like stones clicking in a streambed. He glances at the large map on the wall where coloured pins invade the day like migrating birds. He knows where the landing is, where the guns are likely to be, how the Marines prefer to ladder their frequencies. He still cannot pierce the words. The team around him is not ignorant. They have seen ciphers unspool in their hands when they gathered enough copies of the same field order and pushed the right habit against it. They know that even a proud code can be walked down if its custodians grow lazy or its guardians tired. They trust statistics the way a fisherman trusts weather signs, not perfectly, but often enough to bet a day's work. So they run the only play they have: capture more, log relentlessly, break the stream into notes you can reassemble later, build a corpus thick enough to stand on. Months pass. The corpus thickens. A pinned page labelled Unknown Voice Code swells to a fat wedge in the filing cabinet, the metal handles of adjacent drawers growing cool with the shade cast by its presence. Analysts join the room who have never seen a farm where winter sits long and cold. They're city boys from universities that sent professors to the world's corners before the world taught those professors to stay home. Even they cannot produce what the intercept officers want. No pre-war survey listed the sounds that fill these recordings. The old ethnographies, where they exist, focus on what a visitor could be taught in a season by a family that wished to be polite. They do not contain the distilled, engineered glossaries of a fighting unit. They cannot help a man who needs to extract meaning from speech that has been shaved down to carry only what must be moved from one mind to another through a red fog. The men start to hear things that aren't there. Not hallucinations, exactly, but hints that the brain offers when it is bored of failure. A pair of syllables might recur when the artillery nets wake, and the team wonders if it maps to a grid. A single word might flash when boats call their mothership, and the team wonders if it is a name for ship, for home, for mother. They assign cautious labels in pencil and rub them out at dusk when the count fails to come right. They create a list of probable false friends, words that sound like languages they know but are not. There is a streak of humor in the list that keeps the room human. They put it on the door for a week and then take it down because the commander does not have a sense of humor this month. The search for leverage expands beyond linguistics. Perhaps the key is traffic analysis. If you cannot read meaning, maybe you can read structure. They diagram nets the way an engineer might diagram a machine. A voice here always precedes a barrage there. A check-in there always follows a troop movement here. The arrows on the map begin to resemble intention if you squint. They brief higher-ups on the patterns and suggest that jamming at certain hours might loosen the system's grip on the battlefield. But jamming a net that many men rely on is risky. You might anger the wrong bear. You might make them switch. And now you are deaf when you were at least hearing. The commander signs and unsigns orders like a man who knows both outcomes lead to a type of disappointment he would rather not own before Sunday. 2 months into the effort, a captured backpack arrives with a ragged notebook inside. The room holds its breath. The notebook contains words and hints and made-up spellings that, in a kinder world, would be a treasure any scholar would cradle like a newborn. In this world, it is a partial mirror held at a bad angle. Without a mind trained in the language, and without the training to understand how the words have been bent for combat, the room can't bring the notebook to life. It's like watching someone else's home movie without ever having met the family. The gestures are clear, the intention is loving, but the punchlines miss because you don't know Uncle Pete's habit of dangling his keys. The room copies the notebook and files it with a sigh that is almost reverent, because even an enemy must be honored when they make something well. Requests go out for talent. Is there any man in any university who has taught this language? Is there any prisoner who can make his mouth shape those sounds? The answers are no and no, or no and not without time, which is another way of saying no. In a different theatre, the intercept huts are gold mines. They can turn 5 copies of the same message into an insight that decides a convoy's fate. Here, they are carpenter shops with a lifetime of skill and nothing to plane. They try anyway, because trying is a habit and a pride and a refusal to let the day beat you before dinner. One evening, when the sunset cracks open long enough to make the room look briefly like a chapel, the chief leans on the window frame and says that he doesn't mind losing to a machine. Machines break and can be stolen. He doesn't mind losing to a book. Books can be burned and replaced. What he minds is losing to a voice. There is something maddening about 2 men speaking across the rim of the same sea you sail and having their meaning bounce off your hull like rain. He is not angry with them. He is angry with himself, which is the worst kind of anger because you carry it to bed and it sleeps like a dog you rescued and cannot scold. On a day when the landings go badly, the room listens to a flurry of that unknown speech and hears the rate double. The men speaking are under pressure, and nothing about the syllables breaks. Their net discipline holds. Their pauses are the patient pauses of craftsmen who have learned not to let sweat drop onto fresh varnish. The room grudgingly respects them, the way professionals always respect other professionals. If one of the headsets made the slightest squeal of feedback when the talkers were transmitting, a man in the intercept hut would have leaped to his feet with a wrench, desperate to fix the sin of noise. That's how far professionalism goes, to the point where you cannot help but empathize with someone who is thwarting you because he is working well. The collection grows until it no longer feels like a pile and more like a wall the unit has built to hide the admission that no path through exists. When a new officer arrives, he reads the summaries, hums approvingly, and suggests a schedule of renewed effort that resembles every schedule tried before. No one tells him he is repeating history because this is war, and you let men keep their dignity where they can. He lasts long enough to produce 2 fresh reports and a quiet drinking habit, and then he rotates out. The room remains, along with the hiss of the ocean and the voices that do not slacken. Some wars build monuments to triumph. Others leave rooms like these as their memorial. Tidy, lined with catalogued failure, resolute, and somehow not ashamed. In the end, the lesson that rests on the table between the headphones and the pencils is not about mystery or magic. It is about scale and pace, and the ways that human design can make a weapon out of breath and consonant and agreement. The men in the intercept hut do not say this out loud, but they know it. The war is a test not just of muscle and steel, but of how quickly you can lay meaning into the world and have it acted upon. They have heard meaning laid down 1,000 times over these months and, through no fault of their craft, have acted upon almost none of it. They will keep listening because listening is what they can do. And somewhere over the same water, another set of men will keep speaking because speech is what they must do, and between them the future will choose who moved faster when speed felt like fate. The people who made their living from paper proofs believed that any message yields if you can flatten it into symbols and feed those symbols to patience. That belief had earned them victories. It had toppled grand ciphers dressed in uniforms and titles. It had bent steel rotors to human will. Yet the voices that moved across the Pacific refused to be flattened in the span of time that mattered. They were not strings waiting for a key. They were breath moving through a pattern known to men who had learned that pattern first as children, and then again, with sharper edges, as Marines. When that breath carried a code built to ride it, the usual engines of decryption found themselves trying to measure wind with a ruler. Machines wanted regularity. They wanted characters that sit still and alphabets that march in rows. The traffic offered neither. What arrived at the headphones was speech, shaped by the throat and the teeth, bending with wind, collapsing a little under rain, changing timbre when a man turned his head to watch a shell land. Within that speech sat a deliberate substitution that preferred families of images to sterile tokens. The same idea could be carried by more than one image. The same letter could be borne by more than one word. The pattern was firm enough that trained men could sprint across it without stumbling, and loose enough that a stranger's mathematics never got the steady purchase it craves. You could count syllables all day, and still not touch meaning before meaning had already become action somewhere on a ridge. The barrier was not only acoustic and not only combinatorial, it was cultural in the plainest sense. The images chosen to shoulder new war things were not random ornaments. They were picked for how they would sit in the mouth of a boy from sandstone country, for how quickly a partner would recognize them during a squall, for how easily a team could swap a synonym in when habit threatened to harden into rut. That selection is invisible to strangers. You can copy the word. You cannot copy the childhood that makes that word inevitable. The interceptors were professionals. They tried to build bridges. They tried to fit guessed meanings to repeated shapes. They found themselves tracing water with chalk. Every few weeks the intercept posts tasted hope when a scrap of English brushed the unknown tongue. Stress does that to a human mouth. It reaches for the simplest tool. A clerk would underline the overlap until the pencil tore the paper. The analysts would start a fresh sheet and line up instances the way a geologist lines up cores. A pattern would appear and then wilt. It wilted because the speakers also read the day and adjusted. They had been taught to fear ruts as much as bullets. If repetition grew too neat, a talker would choose a sibling image or shift to the alphabet ladder, and the little graph on the intercept table that had begun to look promising went slack again. The lesson drifted through the hut like a draft. There was no short vocabulary to memorize, no single talismanic table to steal. The best minds in those huts built impressive castles out of what they had, traffic analysis that guessed at command relationships, rate studies that tried to forecast pushes, bearing plots that suggested where a battalion net might be hiding its backbone. Those castles had uses. They helped higher headquarters think in broad strokes. But when a platoon needed a curtain of smoke to shift 20 yards in the next half-minute, castles did not help. The hurt here was not that the code was unbreakable in principle. It was that decipherment could not arrive within the lifespan of a battlefield decision. In war, any answer that comes an hour late is the wrong answer, however elegant its derivation looks in a report. Even a captured notebook changed less than the hungry wanted. It was treasure, yes, but treasure at the wrong temperature. Without a fluent practitioner to warm its words into motion, it remained a list of possibilities instead of a tool. The notebook proved something valuable all the same. The system was not mysticism, it was engineering. It was a careful mapping that anyone with the right training could learn. That admission hurts and heals at once. It removes magic from the story and replaces it with design, and design can be honored properly. It also explains why the interceptors felt their failure so personally. They had been beaten by a better fit between form and purpose, not by luck. The country that listened did not lack cleverness. It lacked bodies grown in the sound and then trained in the craft. Fluency is not a switch. It is how you hear your name from the far side of a field and know who is calling without looking. Had a handful of scholars with the right ears been available, they would still have needed to learn the engineered overlay, the alphabet of images, the rotating synonyms, the habit of compressing thought into packets that land cleanly. Teaching that overlay takes months. War 8 months and asked for more. Long before a classroom could have drawn its first chalk line, the guns on shore had moved again, and the boats had beached somewhere new. The men in the intercept rooms were not fond of the word impossible. They preferred not yet. The honest phrase for what they faced is not solvable inside the span where solving would have caught shells in mid-air. There is a world of difference between a proof you can polish in winter and an answer you must carry in summer with your chest heaving and your hands filthy. The advantage here belonged to the talkers because their work was born at that summer pace. They did not translate and then code. They spoke the code as naturally as breathing. The difference is not rhetorical. It is the difference between marching and running, between drafting a plan and pointing and saying now. In the end, the rooms accepted a conclusion that felt less like surrender than like respect. They were listening to a human system tuned to human time. The defeat was not theirs alone. It belonged to a whole philosophy that had come to believe that volume conquers all. Volume conquers, but only when the quarry stands still. These voices moved. They chose new paths through images, avoided grooves, kept the stream shallow and fast. A net like that does not wait for anyone. It does its work and is gone. The ledgers in the intercept cabinets grew thick with proof of effort. The answer they wanted did arrive years later, after the shooting stopped when the speakers were allowed to explain the maps they had carried in their heads. By then, the only thing the answer could give was understanding. On the days that decided battles, understanding had travelled by another road entirely, running on breath and memory toward men who could act before smoke settled. Picture a morning when the horizon looks carved from slate. A forward observer is wedged behind lava that cracks like old pottery, his cheek pressed to glass, his spine complaining. His partner is a talker with one hand resting on a radio, as if it were a living thing that shivers when the sea breathes. The observer sees a bunker, exhale a thin sheet of smoke, and waits for the gun to speak again to show its exact mouth. The second muzzle flash gives him the line he needs. He says the correction in a sentence that is both old and new at once, old in the shape of the words, and new in the way war has taught those words to carry steel. Offshore, a man who has been listening since dawn hears the line, unwraps it the instant it touches his ear, and turns his head toward the gunnery officer. A ship's muscles tighten. The next shells arrive as if they were listening too. That moment is one frame. The day is made of hundreds. Timelines inside logbooks record the tempo in unemotional numbers. Call, correction, splash, adjustment, fire for effect. The loops tightened until a human could feel them without looking at a watch. Before, a request was a stone rolled up a hill of forms. Now it was a signal stepping, across the gap like a man crossing a narrow creek. When a loop becomes that short, choices change. You do not hoard requests for fear of wasting a quarter hour. You ask for the small shift that makes a big difference. The battlefield does not reward thrift. It rewards accuracy delivered on time. Speed made accuracy possible because it allowed men to refine one another in real time instead of in the past tense. Opponents sensed this even without understanding the syllables. The intercept records, tidy and frustrated, prove as much. Rate is a language of its own. Nets that crackle at a certain pace, then double and then settle, tell a story any veteran can read. Jammers tried to marry themselves to those rises, pouring noise into the path when the curve climbed. Short messages slipped through like sparrows in wind. A system built to favor brief, crisp packets, denies the jammer the luxury of chewing on anything. By the time a howl reaches the frequency with enough power to bother it, the phrase has landed and the next phrase is already in the air on a slightly different route. The men at the radios felt this advantage the way a runner feels a tailwind. They did not waste it by growing chatty. They pruned their sentences until only load, bearing words survived. Speed did not arrive for free. A unit that relies on fast loops must guard the mouths that keep those loops alive. Talkers were never alone. A partner stayed near with a weapon, and with the other kind of vigilance, the alertness that spots gear trouble half a heartbeat before it blooms. A loose connector can be as deadly as a bad corner. A dying battery can play the villain at the worst time. Partners learn to read the talker's shoulders, to tell whether a pause meant thinking or interference. They learn to nudge the antenna with a fingertip no one else would notice. They learn to substitute their own hands when a talker needed to crawl a yard sideways and keep speaking while the earth kicked. Speed changed command behavior in quieter ways as well. Officers who had grown up with runners and long silences felt the shock of being able to ask a question and get a useful answer, while the question still mattered. Requests that had been postponed under the old economy because the price in minutes was too high now felt cheap enough to spend. A smoke screen could be nudged like a curtain. A warning could chase a squad down an alley of rocks before they entered a crossfire. When you watch actors move with responsiveness you did not have last month, you write different scenes. War is staging as much as it is force. The diaries of men who lived through those days use a revealing verb. They say the ships listened. They say the guns answered. The language is not childish. It is precise. When a system moves at human pace, people give it human grammar. They trust it the way they trust a man who has proven he will keep an appointment. Trust is fuel. With trust in the loop, a small unit will attempt a maneuver it might otherwise abandon. With trust in the loop, a commander will hold his nerve 2 minutes longer and be right. You cannot buy that with doctrine alone. You earn it by delivering, and the talkers delivered under conditions that punish promise makers. None of this erased fear. A talker's voice, when played back, carries tightness that never goes away. There is a quaver in certain syllables that comes from speaking under a sky that throws hot iron at random, yet the quaver never eats the message. The system made room for fear but did not permit it to become static. Speed, in the end, is not just about how fast a word travels. It is about how much of a man's courage survives the journey. When replies come quickly, courage lasts longer. When corrections arrive before doubt has time to multiply, men stay inside the action rather than retreat into caution. That margin shows up nowhere in the tables and everywhere in the ground taken. Imagine a day when a tank's track snarls on rebar and a hand-sized fuse chooses that moment to ruin a plan. The talker's partner shoves the set sideways just far enough to keep the antenna from clipping a beam. The talker keeps speaking while reaching back to free the cable with 2 fingers. The correction arrives offshore before his hand leaves the wire. The gun lifts a pattern of shells a few yards, and in that space the tank's crew hauls the track straight. All anyone else sees is motion resuming. What happened is that a human loop held under strain. When the sun goes down and the set is finally allowed to be heavy, the talker will sleep like a stone, not because the day was short, but because the seconds were. The devices that ferried those voices were imperfect, stubborn, and somehow endearing, the way any tool becomes when it does low magic in rough hands. A set that looked manageable on a clean table turned treacherous on a beach where sand got into everything. Batteries sulked, wires kinked. Switches that had clicked like snare drums in a training hall decided to feel gummy as fruit on the day you needed them honest. Yet when a unit learned its gear, and the gear learned the unit, the net behaved like a living organ that refused to fail in the same place twice. There is a kind of affection that grows between a craftsman and the thing that serves him. That affection radiated from the way these men touched their radios. Discipline began before a button was pressed. Nets were laid out with the care a cook gives a tiny kitchen that will feed a crowd at the same minute. Frequencies were assigned like stools where each voice knew where to sit and when to get up. Call signs rotated before they grew too comfortable. The talkers kept their sentences lean because lean survives weather. Partners kept their microphones steady even when their elbows shivered, because a wavering hand skews a vowel, and a skewed vowel costs a shell. Net control was a temperament as much as a role. The best controllers kept a wary kindness in their tone. They made space for urgency without letting urgency flood the room. Protection of the talkers was not ritual, it was tactics. Units learned quickly that a man who could make the big guns breathe needed a shadow who could shoot straight and recognize trouble a half-beat early. The shadow learned the talker's rhythm until he could guess when a head would rise, which meant his eyes were already looking where danger would come from. He learned to tell the difference between a pause that meant choosing the exact image and a pause that meant the line had gone dirty. He learned to keep a hand on the set without crowding it, to keep the antenna clear without making it a flag. Improvisation mattered as much as doctrine. Antennas are fussy creatures. On one beach a vertical sang. On another an inverted L whispered better. Men learned to read the place, to see where a wire could run under a pier beam, where a mast could hide behind a stump that no sniper would waste a bullet on. They learned to tune by touch and rule of thumb, to steal a mess tin to make a length behave when a proper meter lived on a ship they could not reach. The ocean did not care about specifications. It cared about whether current moved at that moment through that soil with that mood of salt. The sets themselves carried scars like veterans. A hatch had gouged one. A careless forklift had kissed another. Some proved blessed. Others were jinxed until a patient man exorcised the gremlins with alcohol, cloth, and curses that sounded like prayer. Talkers named their boxes because names are what humans give to things that have saved them twice. In a war where so much was anonymous, granting a name to a tool was a way of measuring gratitude. The names were private and unimportant and meant everything. Training never stopped. Between operations there were hours set aside for rest that turned into drills because skill leaks when not watched. Talkers practiced while boots dried on lines and coffee burned in a pot that remembered too many meals. They practiced against wind that shoved at syllables and under roofs that turned rain into iron pellets. They practiced loud and soft. They practiced the alphabet mapping until it felt like stepping stones across a stream. Partners quizzed them without mercy until an answer arrived with the same certainty as a reflex. Precision loves repetition. Repetition loves men who are willing to be bored for a noble reason. Security sat on every table like an extra set of hands. If a notebook existed, it lived like a dangerous pet, kept close and under a firm grip. If a set had to be abandoned, it did not go alone. Certain arrangements ensured that what could not be carried would not be used by anyone else. No one wanted to think about that, the way no one wants to imagine leaving a friend behind, but imagining it kept people honest. Mostly, security came from speed. A message that is already acted upon by the time an enemy hears it is a message that cannot betray you. There was also a quieter discipline of care. A partner would lift a radio out of a puddle with parental disgust and spend an hour rubbing warmth back into its bones. Someone would scavenge a gasket from a ruined set because the one in use had torn just enough to let damp breed failure at a wicked moment. Someone else would trade away small luxuries for a spare handset because the mouthpiece on his had developed a buzz that irritated a talker when his heart was already beating too fast. These acts do not glitter in history, but they are the stitches that keep a net from tearing. When the net was alive and the day needed it, the whole lattice of discipline and improvisation felt like tide. You could hear a pulse at dawn as check-ins rolled, a neat rhythm like boots on boards. You could hear strain at noon when requests jostled in a narrow lane. You could hear relief in the late hours when someone remembered to say thank you, which men did, even if the thanks was only a clipped syllable. The set did not blush at gratitude, but you could tell it worked better for people who were generous to it. That is superstition, a sergeant would say, and then he would pat the case before turning away. Across the water in rooms filled with headphones and patients, professionals would have recognized the same virtues. They would have nodded at the coils hung to dry and the quiet jokes traded over battered microphones. They would have recognized the faith men placed in small rituals and the way those rituals held chaos at bay. Nothing about this felt like spectacle. It felt like work done properly, and work done properly thrives under pressure. That is why the net, when cut, knit itself again. That is why, when a mouth fell silent, another mouth spoke the same promise, and the promise kept walking forward. By the time the boats turned toward the Sulphur Island, the voice system was no longer a novelty or a clever trick. It was a habit stitched into units that had crossed too much water to count. On the morning, the first waves crawled toward the black beach. Men who had never met trusted that when they spoke a certain set of syllables, the ships would move steel for them, as if a rope connected their lungs to the turrets. The island was small on a map and infinite under boot soles. Every depression was a trap. Every contour hinted at an opening and hid a mouth instead. The only thing that seemed to travel clean was sound, and even sound arrived frayed at the edges where wind and ash chewed it. The first hours were a contest between tide and fire. Boats clogged where exits should have been. Bulldozers worked like oxen in syrup. Guns offshore, constrained by safety and hope in equal measure, growled, and then fell silent, and then erupted when calls came clear. The voice traffic did not spike so much as become weather. It crowded the frequencies without spilling into panic, a pressure system you could feel in your teeth. Operators who had drilled this day into their bones breathed shallow and kept phrases clipped like nails. Shore parties narrated without drama. Ships listened. The loop tightened to the point where a mistake would have been contagious if men had let themselves hurry. They did not. Haste and speed are cousins who ruin each other when they meet. At mid-morning, a platoon pinned by a machine gun nested in a cave needed a shot aimed like a surgeon's finger. The talker slid down a fold of ash that tried to swallow his boots and spoke a correction pitched for the microphone alone. Offshore, a man who had been sifting voices since dawn recognized the tone that means the world is tilting and turned his head before the last word finished. The gun captain watched his pointer twitch a breath's width and nodded. The next burst sent dust sighing out of the cave's throat. The platoon moved. No one on the beach cheered. They did not have the air to spare. Elsewhere, a tank battalion tried to climb a slope that looked passable from the water and turned traitor under tracks. The lead tank's commander doubled as a talker's partner because the unit had learned to put voices where the weight would be. He relayed and then became the relay when the talker had to free a cable trapped in sprocket teeth. The correction from offshore came so quickly that the battalion shifted right in one gesture, like a school of fish deciding together. It felt choreographed. It was not. It was practice finding its moment. The storm had an eye. In those small calms, the talkers rechecked their glossaries as if smoothing a prayer book. They took water carefully because thirst blurs consonants first. Partners asked for battery status and learned which call signs were tired and which were bright. Fatigue smears stops. The good sets betray it. The good partners hear it and nudge with a joke dropped like a pebble into a bucket. The talkers answer with a word as clean as a first take. Then the wall comes. Back, the air goes metallic again, and the net resumes its hum. Interference came and went like malice with a bad antenna. Sometimes the enemy hurled noise into the lanes just as a wave of traffic threatened to peel men off a ridge. Noise is a bully that loves crowds. The talkers countered by tightening even further, abandoning a secondary image for a primary one, leaning on the alphabet ladder when a picture might blur. Offshore, the map showed the jamming as dirty weather. The gunnery crews rode it out because they had learned that the phrases they cared about would still find a path. On the third day, when drama settled into work, fresh companies came ashore carrying talkers who looked too young until they started to speak. Seasoned men listened to their cadence and made the small nod that transfers a burden. Here, carry this with us. Keep the rope taut while we catch a breath. The new voices did, and the net did not change its gait. If you stepped back far enough to be cruel, you could say that the storm of messages proved nothing about glory and everything about logistics. But that would miss the point that logistics at this scale requires art. The art was in cadence, in choosing images that never snagged under stress, in keeping sentences from blooming into anything that would steal time. If you chart the battle by shells, by yards gained, by photographs, you will still miss something essential about the way it was won. It lives in the small intervals between a phrase and the metal that obeyed it. Those intervals shrank until men could feel them as part of their bodies. A sergeant could sense that if he asked for the smoke to walk now, it would walk while his squad was still bent and running, not after they had flattened themselves and cursed. A lieutenant could feel that a warning would reach a neighboring line while the warning still had the power to change feet, not just minds. When intervals shrink into sensation, decisions change. When the island finally allowed quiet to hang for a moment, the men tried to describe what the air had felt like to people who had not breathed it. Some reached for music and talked about counterpoint woven too tightly to tease apart. Some grew simple and said they spoke and were heard. The reports stayed sober and counted exchanges in numbers that would have sounded like boasting if the ink had not been official. Somewhere in a drawer is a page that notes 1,000 useful conversations in a slice of time that would once have held a few dozen. The number is less astonishing than the fact that the voices inside it never tripped each other. In rooms across the water, the last summaries were filed with tidy despair. Everything had been heard. Almost nothing had been understood in time to matter. The men who wrote those lines had the courtesy to praise their opponents. They would have preferred a war of machines alone. Machines can be matched. This system had machines, yes, but it also had lungs and habits and a trust so intricate that it could turn breath into ordnance and back into breath without losing its place. On a small island black with ash and loud with iron, that trust held, and when flags rose and cameras clicked and a picture travelled around the world, the caption could not include the storm. It lived in the air and did its work, and left no monument but the ground that men kept. If you stack the intercept logs from the early landings to the war's last islands, the pile becomes a kind of monument to persistence. Dates, bearings, guest call signs, the same careful notations of weather and static, the same abrupt underlinings when a phrase seems to echo something from last week. Anyone raised on the creed that sheer volume breaks resistance would assume that a crack must appear. It did not, or not in time to matter. The reason lives in the mismatch between how desks solve puzzles and how battles consume minutes. The men with headphones built their case methodically. They traced the grammar of events. At certain hours, a certain cadence returned. Whenever artillery woke, a pair of syllables grew common. Whenever landing craft neared surf, another shape of sound reappeared and then vanished as if embarrassed by being seen twice. The hut's blackboard filled with arrows connecting the hour to a curve in the rate, and the curve to an expected move. Above those arrows they wrote a shy set of guesses about meaning. It was good work, honourable work, the sort of work that could guide a distant commander's mood. Yet what it lacked was the one property the other side had turned into a weapon: immediacy. When speech is both the encryption and the engine, when the speakers have rehearsed each substitution until it drops from the mouth like muscle memory, analysis becomes a shadow that always falls a pace behind. The material obstacles were merciless. There was no well of trained ears to draw from. Pre-war scholarship could not provide a grammar drilled to hold under bombardment. The few artifacts captured note scraps, imperfect glossaries, letter tables written by hand in a training tent were hints, not keys. The images chosen to shoulder new meaning were chosen for the men who would carry them, not for outsiders who hoped to reverse engineer intention. You could circle a word that turned up near beaches, but if the next week that word migrated to a different duty because someone had decided a synonym would travel better in rain, your circles became fossils of a behavior that no longer existed. Time was the cruelest boundary. The huts kept faith with the future. They believed that if you listened long enough, if you counted cleanly enough, a structure would emerge, and in a sense it did. Years later, when the doors of secrecy opened and the talkers could explain how they had done their work, the intercept sheets found belated confirmation. But wars do not grade on delayed clarity. A correction that changes the fate of a squad must be understood in the next minute, not in an appendix written after the armistice. The code was not invulnerable, it was fast. In practice, those two qualities look identical to anyone trying to catch up. The talkers never left footprints where haste could follow. They kept options alive inside the lexicon. They chose images that sat close enough together that a partner could swap without asking permission, and far enough apart that pattern could not harden into habit. They refused to let the alphabet mapping become a chant that an eavesdropper could use as a ladder. They also refused to let cleverness slow their hands. If a choice threatened to cost a heartbeat, they chose its simpler sibling, because nothing defeats analysis like a message that is already old when the pencil finds the paper. At the human level, the failure bit hardest in the quiet after the set was switched off. Professionals dislike losing to the unexamined. They loathe losing to another craft practiced well. The men in the intercept huts knew they were facing a tool built to fit a particular war as a key fits a lock. They had fought locks before and learned to pick them with persistence. Here, the lock kept walking. The machine never got its teeth on the meat. The notebook that promised a breakthrough always revealed itself as a mirror at the wrong angle. The signal that seemed to be a noun one day behaved like a verb the next. What looked like a cipher turned out to be a conversation. Defeat did not mean uselessness. Traffic analysis still sketched the outlines of operations. Direction finding still told ships where to watch. But the dream that a flood of recordings could be transmuted into an immediate tactical map, a map that would steal decisions from the other side in the very minute they were made, died honestly. The opposite occurred. Voice carried decisions into action so quickly that the act destroyed the window in which decryption might have lived. If you want to know why months of listening failed, the answer is not romance. It is tempo. A river that runs shallow and fast can be crossed by those who know it. To everyone else, it is only noise and light. When the ocean regained its peacetime voice and ships returned to painting their rails against rust, the voices that had moved fire and men did not become museum pieces. They became secrets. Orders were simple. Do not talk. Men who had carried a working language in their throats through smoke and rain learned to carry silence with the same discipline. The world around them filled with parades and reminiscences, with big band music turning memory into an evening at a dance hall. Their portion was different. They folded their uniforms and put their notebooks away. They returned to families that had known only that their sons and brothers had been somewhere far and dangerous with a radio on their backs. There was an argument behind that quiet. It was not just habit or a failure of gratitude. The design still had potential use. The idea that a human language braided to a compact code could outrun interception remained valuable in a world where the next fight was never entirely imaginary. The military kept the file drawers shut, not out of miserliness, but because premature praise can also be a leak. Secrecy, like the radios that enabled it, demands maintenance. Years passed. Men changed jobs and raised children, and when asked at a bar what they had done in the islands, mastered the useful art of a smile and a vaguer story about landing zones and bad chow. Recognition came the way dawn does when the horizon is crowded slowly. Then all at once, a trickle of declassifications made their way into papers with headlines that seemed modest to anyone who had watched the system work. Stories took shape in public that had been private obligations for too long. The men at their center found themselves photographed again in borrowed blouses and new medals, the copper and ribbon catching a light that for once felt clean. Families who had grown up with a father's reputation as a quiet man learned what that quiet contained. Communities took pride with the fierce gentleness that marks a story you can claim without jealousy. Doctrine absorbed the lesson with the dispassion it must maintain. Manuals do not have room for sentiment. They spoke instead of tempo and of the way a communication system earns its keep when it can make human speed safe. They stressed redundancy that does not collapse when equipment fails, and security that does not rest on the hope that the enemy is lazy. They referenced case studies in language that hid the emotions of those days like a polished table hides the grain of the tree it used to be. Behind the paragraphs was an admission that mattered. Sometimes the best technology is a human design carried in memory and breath, not because hardware is weak, but because people are faster than any gear that needs to be cranked. There were awkward moments in this transition. The world had grown by then into a place where cipher machines were becoming small and confident, and where satellites would soon grow ears that dwarfed anything a jungle hut could dream of. To insist that a war had been shaped by voices felt almost deliberately contrarian to men who loved machinery and saw the future coming. The counter-argument was not nostalgia. It was clarity. The human system had not outshone the machines because the machines were primitive. It had outshone them because it was designed for a problem measured in pulses of terror and choices that ripened in minutes. In that space, even a perfect cipher can be the wrong tool. That truth fit neatly in a doctrine line and awkwardly in the minds of people who equate progress with wires. As the secrecy thinned, museums asked for artifacts, a headset here, a battered handset there, a set whose corners had been rounded by 100 rough rides ashore. A small glass case cannot hold the thing that mattered, which was the confidence in the loop between shore and ship, but it can invite a visitor to lean closer and imagine an instant when a word decided whether a shell would land 3 yards left. Schools wrote up units on the program with careful language, the kind that makes room for pride without letting the edges turn into myth. The men most allergic to myth were often the men who had made it possible. They accepted the attention with the same dignity they had used to accept orders. Policy found other uses for the underlying idea. In conflicts that never grew to the size of continents, commanders still needed human speed. The thought that you can pair fluency with a light overlay to shorten loops survived. It did not always take the same form, and it could not usually borrow the same language, but the seed scattered and rooted in places where radios hum and men crouch over maps that will be trash before nightfall. The system had never been a relic. It had always been a reminder that war is conducted by people whose bodies move through time, and any design that honors that fact earns a place in the next plan. The final chapter of secrecy closed not with a flourish but with a quiet normalization. What had once required circumspection became a story schools could tell. Communities wrote their names into State House halls alongside other regiments and units whose feats had been celebrated earlier. The men who had kept their part promised kept one more. They spoke without bitterness, as if secrecy itself had been a duty as necessary as carrying a spare battery up a slope. They were finally allowed to say what every man who had heard them already knew, that language, purpose-built and carried by memory, can be as sharp as any steel you can lift. Stories about the voices hardened quickly into the kind of legends that make good posters and bad history. One says that the language alone made the transmissions invulnerable, as if a single barrier of unfamiliar sound could defeat any listener. Another insists that the other side shrugged and never tried very hard, as if professionals choose to ignore the knife that keeps pricking them. The sweetest myth says that what happened was simple. Men talked in their mother tongue and the world failed to catch up. These stories comfort because they make a messy, engineered success look tidy. The truth is less ornate and more useful. The language mattered, but not as a talisman. It mattered because it provided a landscape familiar to the men who had to run it at speed. It mattered because a vocabulary already rich in images could be tuned to carry machines and maneuvers without breaking in the mouth. It mattered because outsiders could not borrow fluency overnight. But the margin did not come from language alone. It came from discipline, from an overlay designed to thwart pattern, from a culture of brevity that made each phrase a tool instead of a speech. It came from men who drilled until they could speak precisely with their heart hammering and sand scouring their teeth. The notion that the enemy did not try founders on the evidence. Their logs are exhaustive. Their summaries, sometimes grudging and sometimes admiring, confess the truth of contact without comprehension. They jammed when they could. They filed when they could not. They made educated guesses, and sometimes those guesses were close enough to shape a patrol's caution. What they could not do was build a translation engine nimble enough to join the fight before the fight had turned. In a sense, their effort dignifies the story. A problem is most clearly defined by the good work it resists. The most tempting simplification that this was just talking ignores what any practitioner recognizes in the first minute: conversion. The speakers were not merely transmitting civilian conversation into unfamiliar air. They were converting. They were running an alphabet through images and feeding core terms through a set of choices designed to keep pace high and boredom low. They were maintaining a living codebook in their heads and hands, adapting to fresh synonyms and revised mappings as the field learned. It was labor. It was artfully disguised as ease. To mistake the appearance for the reality is to dishonor the practice. There is also the myth that any language would have done. That story forgets logistics as brutally as any myth can. You need speakers who share enough of a dialect to avoid friction. You need a pool wide enough to sustain rotations and casualties. You need a language whose internal structure can be harnessed to compactness without growing muddy. You need training time, trust from commanders, the patience to let a new system mature under pressure. Many languages are beautiful. Few could have been bent that quickly and that cleanly into this particular shape for this particular war. The last myth turns the success into a quaint trick that belongs in a display case labeled with a sepia date. It assumes that the lesson does not travel, yet the reality stubbornly reappears wherever men must enact decisions faster than machinery can mediate. The details change, the doctrine evolves, the radios shrink into pockets, the core persists. If you compare a community of fluent speakers with a light, disciplined overlay that preserves tempo, you can build a loop that resists interception, not through absolute secrecy, but through perishable usefulness. It will not help you write an epic after the fact. It will help you tilt a moment, while the moment is still alive. A good way to tell you have stepped out of myth and into reality is to notice how unspectacular the truth sounds when put plainly. Men trained. They rehearsed. They protected one another. They spoke with care. They accepted that security lies not only in hiding information, but in rendering it obsolete by acting quickly. They used a language that fit their mouths and minds, and then engineered it to fit a war. The result was not a miracle. It was a design, so well matched to its task that from the outside it looked like one. Every system leaves a wake. For a long time, the only wake this one allowed was a field cleared at the right minute and a man who got to breathe again because steel had moved when it was asked. Years later, the wake widened into textbooks and citations, into ceremonies where old shoulders carried new ribbons, into museum cases where a child can press a forehead to glass and try to imagine what a voice must have sounded like under fire. If you listen in those rooms very carefully, you can almost hear the hum that filled the nets. It is not nostalgia, it is the physics of breath turned into action. What endures is a lesson about fit. To move men at the edge of danger, you choose a tool built for edges. You pick a medium that rides the world as it is, not as the tidy diagrams show it on a whiteboard. You accept that security based on denial will always fray, and you instead double down on security based on pace. You refuse to let elegance slow you down. You commit to clarity that forgives stress. You ask for discipline that can survive weather. You build a thing that functions entirely at human scale and therefore outruns larger machines at the exact moments when small decisions decide everything. It is easy to be sentimental about such a design and just as easy to be cynical. The sentimental version puts a halo on men who would have rather kept their heads low than their reputations high. The cynical version waves a hand and says that the future belongs to satellites and ciphers you cannot lift without a dolly. The quiet truth is less dramatic. People will always make decisions inside windows so narrow that only breathing can cross them. Whenever that is the case, the old architecture of fluency married to a pragmatic overlay will be there waiting, ready to be taught again, ready to prove once more that speed, when yoked to meaning, can turn a small sound into a decisive act. Imagine, finally, a room on a ship where a man stands at a plot board as the ocean leans and the air shakes with other people's thunder. A voice reaches him that does not belong to his childhood and that he could not teach to his son in a summer. He understands it anyway because it has been built to be understood by the right few and transformed for everyone else into urgency. He signals. The ship answers. Far away, a slope loosens and men move forward. No one claps. No one quotes poetry. The moment passes into the next one, where some other voice will ask for a different nudge with the same calm insistence. When the war ends and the voices go quiet, the silence will feel like a wound and a relief. The headset will sit on a hook that never quite relaxes. The man will remember the cadence and forget the exact words, which is fitting, because the exact words were never the point. The point was the sound that could not be stolen in time. Long after the last log sheet yellows in a drawer, the design remains intelligible to anyone who has ever tried to do something hard in the span between a breath and a choice. Speak clearly. Move quickly. Keep faith with the partner who is listening. Build a path that belongs to you and your work, and let the world hear the noise without ever giving it the meaning. That is the legacy. Not romance, not myth, a craft, perfected under pressure, that left behind ground held and lives unspilled, and a standard that says human speed, rightly harnessed, is its own kind of unbreakable code.